What's going on, everybody? It's the Reformation Keegan, and I'm back here with another one-shot comic analysis. And today we have the heavy Superman, Where is Thy Sting? And I have to say that this cover is phenomenal. It's actually one of my favorite Superman covers. I think it just looks really great. It's got a nice pastel look to it, and I didn't know really what to expect going into this story when I read it, and I had bought this a long time ago, and I don't believe that Where's Thy Sting has been printed anywhere else. I believe this is the only way that you can acquire it because it's not an Elseworld story, but it kind of feels like an Elseworld story. It kind of feels like it's outside of the Superman canon, but also kind of interrelated. So that's a bit of a paradox. But there's a lot of good with this story. And first, I want to address what the title means. Where's Thy Sting? Which I just want to make sure I have the quote correctly. Where's Thy Sting means where is the suffering, pain, and death? And this is actually from the Corinthians section of the Bible. And I'm not going to say that I am super well immersed with the Bible. I have not fully studied the Bible, but this title is very, very indicative for what I'm going to talk about. And like I said, because these are one-shot stories, these videos aren't going to be super long, but I found Where's Thy Sting to be very informative, and I think it's a really, really nice addition to the Superman canon, and I believe that this is a book that if you are a fan of Superman, you definitely should read. So Superman, in a lot of ways, philosophically, has to battle with his own consciousness. And what I mean by that is he has to battle with things in the story that are really beyond his own control. So, for example, dreaming is beyond his control. Because when we dream, our consciousness goes to a different form of reality that we cannot control and that we can only decipher for about 20 to 30 minutes. So dreams in this essence are uncontrollable, but the human mind tries to do what they can to control them when they are eventually awake. And that's what happens here in the story. So we can see how a dream affects Superman. So he goes to the Martian Manhunter, aka John Jones, for help. And he yells out, H'ronmeer. And what we find out is that this is the Martian god of death because the Martian Manhunter has the ability to be a telepath and to essentially read the mind of a subject. And Clark tells Lois that he feels a panic inside him. And this is very uncommon because usually Superman knows how to handle a lot of situations. And he feels a blind panic. So a blind panic for Superman is something that he doesn't experience a lot unless if it's chemically altered. So Clark finds in this dream a Kryptonian baby, which he believes may be him, which is a symbol of one individual, and that's Clark in this case. Clark essentially feels survivor's guilt. He feels guilt upon seeing this image for being the only survivor of Krypton. So because Krypton is a place where so many people had died, and Clark was the only one to survive and come to Earth and live a fulfilling life, this dream and this lack of control is making Clark face things that he's never faced before. And guilt is something that Clark does face a lot, but not to this level. And one of the other things too is he cites to Lois that he feels this guilt. And Lois in this story is his muse, because in a lot of ways this story is about their love, but how blind and devoted that love is when against adversity beyond the control of somebody who can supposedly control the world. And we can see Clark cries and he tears up, and it's very uncommon for Clark to cry in this way, but because again, it's something that he cannot control. So this is the main question. How does Clark deal with death? Another big proponent of this story. So we see how he gives up on life in part 2 when Lois dies in the year 2050, because we have death personified, the actual death, appear as a character. And death shows Superman what the outcome is going to be. So we can see him in 2050 completely unravel at the death of Lois. And because Lois dies, this kind of creates a sense of nihilism where Clark feels like he has nothing else to live for. So in part 2 of this book, because this book is separated into 3 different parts, Death says the following to Clark: "You are an anomaly, and you intrigue me almost as much as you infuriate me," which is on page 33. And the reason why this happens is because Clark is something that Death almost can't control, and Death is trying within all the fiber of his being to control Clark and kind of say, you know, everybody has a time that they're going to expire. And Clark is the one to go against that claim and outright refute it. And in relation, Death says when hope dies, that's when Superman dies. So this creates a really interesting dilemma here, because Death basically looks for a way for Superman to die in any way, shape, or form. And Death also, in this case, looks at Superman from a spiritualistic point of view. And Superman's spirit is more likely to die rather than his physical manifestation. So on page 55, this is one of the quotes that I found very, very indicative. "Evil isn't a disease, but a wound that can be healed." Because when you read this, you might think that Death himself as a character is evil, but that's not really the case. It's Death represents a cycle of life that only human beings can fathom. And that cycle is you're born, you live your life, and then eventually your time comes up and you pass on. And then we can answer questions later on when we're in the greater beyond, if there is a greater beyond. So evil in this case is something that is almost like a narcotic. And this is a narcotic that human beings are unfortunately very susceptible to. And human folly is something that attracts evil as a narcotic. But this is something that Clark is still relating to, because Clark is still an alien, but he has the traits of a traditional good human being. And we can see here that Clark and Superman have to come with the terms, with the fact basically that all things at some point, and that all things at some point have to expire, but also that creation is just a cycle, and Clark is a spoke on the proverbial wheel. And in part 3, we get an epiphany, and we get something that's a little unexpected. This is actually a sense of irony in a way. You have Death thanking Superman for providing him with hope about the concepts of beginnings and ends. And this is where we can get into the discussion about beginnings and origins. What Superman's origins are, what Death's origins are, what the origin of Death is in general. But this is an epiphany because Death sees the value in Superman and sees the value in Superman alive. And Death finds out that the conception of Death, and not just him as, well, an entity, is not always nihilistic. Hope and nihilism are the two juxtaposed entities that essentially create this story, along with love and devotion between Clark and Lois, because Lois is presented, like I said earlier, as the muse that is always going to be there for Clark through thick and thin. And here, in the end, Clark wakes up. We find out this is just a big dream. But is it? Because I think this is more realistic than meets the eye. So Clark wakes up and he tells Lois that this was a wonderful dream. And I think it was a dream of triumph and tragedy and then back to triumph. Because I think this epitomizes how Clark, even as an alien, has this feeling to love more than anyone else on Earth, along with Lois. So what we find out is dreams imitate reality. And when dreams imitate reality, they're seen in a physical form going forward, as we can see throughout this story. So this was a dream that probably, like I said, lasted 20 to 30 minutes. And then Clark wakes up and finds out that he's still processing cognitively these images that have been in his mind. And they're realistic because if we look in the canon of Superman, we have to understand how much tragedy Clark has gone through, right? He showed up by himself in a rocket, not really knowing what was happening, lost both his biological parents, communicates with Jor-El in a very unconventional way when we're looking at it from a perspective of human nature. And Clark also has to live a life as a human being where he has to deal with human emotion on top of dealing with his own emotion, both as an adopted human being and as an alien. So stories like these really show how Clark is not just an adopted human being, but it basically shows how Clark himself has to live with the fact that death is a human construct. And it's something that he has to still overcome since he has to live in a world with human beings. So that's a bit of my analysis for Superman Where Is Thy Sting. I highly recommend anyone read this, especially if you know the character, because I think to read this, you have to have an understanding of the character in general, and at least have a broad understanding. But it's a really good read. I think it's one of the better Superman stories, which is saying a lot. And it's a quick read. You can get this done really quickly. It's just a one shot, and I think it tells a lot of really cool stories, like I said, about nihilism, about love, about loyalty, about philosophy, about the theories of death. There's a lot to take in, but in a good way. So again, that's Superman Where Is Thy Sting? And most of all, don't forget to like, share, comment, subscribe. We're at 500 subscribers now. Let's hope to get to 1,000 down the road, and I can put out more and better content for you, because if I hit 3,000 watch hours, I become a YouTube partner. See you soon.